Sawadee Karp, hello and welcome to another Victor Black Masterclass video. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the subject of training intensity. Okay, so we're going to be looking at how training intensity impacts on our progress in terms of results. And we're going to be looking at three aspects of this. First, what does Bro Law, what does experience tell us about the subject of training intensity? What does the current sports science evidence have to say? And finally, I'll be wrapping up with my personal opinion so that you can have potentially some takeaways from this conversation that you can execute in the gym. So let's just start with explaining that where this fits into our hierarchical pyramid of what is important and what is not important. In my opinion, far too many guys today spend way too much time talking about what I like to call minutia. And minutia basically is small details that, as fascinating as they may be, have very, very little impact on outcomes. And I can spend hours and hours and hours talking to guys about very interesting, trivial details that result in very small differentials in the gym. So we need to invest our time on things that make profound differences. Where does this discussion fit? Right here, volume load we'll be talking about. After adherence, specificity, volume load. I made a previous video that talked about sets, the number of sets that I recommend you should do in a training block in a week. This video is about the weight and the reps. So collectively, when we bind these together, we call this volume load. Okay, so let's start with the Bro Law. If you were to talk to people online, or you were to talk to people in the gym about what they think about training intensity, fundamentally, what the average guy is going to tell you is this, and that is that you should train in the 6 to 15 rep range. This is called the hypertrophy rep range. And most guys will say 6 to 15. Some guys will say 6 to 12, 6 to 10, but you know, it's average guy will say 6 to 15 is the hypertrophy rep range, and that's where you get optimal muscle outcomes, muscle growth. And for the average guy, 6 to 15 reps is about 60 to 80% of their one repetition max. If you don't know what that means, that simply means the maximum amount of weight you can do one repetition on their exercise for. So when they're doing 6 to 15, they're doing 60 to 80% of their one repetition. Okay, so talk about a couple of quick problems that might be associated with higher loads and lower reps. And basically the first one is that generally that will mean lower volume load, generally. So if the weight goes up, generally the repetitions come down and the collective total of volume load, right, would potentially come down on a set basis. And if you believe that volume load is what matters, that could potentially impact your outcomes here. And the second thing is you often hear the complaint that people say that when the repetition numbers come down, that they can't feel the target muscle being worked. They don't have that same mind-muscle connection as they do when they have high repetition counts. Okay, a couple of possible problems going the other way where they basically bring in lower loads and higher reps. A lot of people assume that that means that you're going to recruit fewer motor units and therefore potentially have lesser hypertrophic outcomes. And secondly, the tension in the muscle is too low to create those outcomes as well. Okay, what does sports science have to tell us? Basically, what sports science can tell us is that when you look at all of the study data that's been collected since kind of the year 2000-ish, right up to today, that, and this is the one-line response, that there is very, very little difference between moderate and high-intensity training outcomes for most people most of the time, between moderate and high intensity. Okay, so there are a couple of caveats to this, and I'm going to dive into that and explain it to you when I get to my say. And I just want you to look at this column here for my comments. So a number of these studies, part of the problem with study data is always going to be we're not studying bodybuilders. Okay, I'm going to comment about this later on. This is data that is, these studies are on untrained subjects. It's basically kids at university, for want of a better word. These studies were done on trained subjects, but I'll come back and expand on that conversation. This is the study data on moderate versus lower intensity training. And as much as I hate to admit it, because I don't like to train this way, I have always believed that this is not correct, right? The study data, the sports science community data, right, basically is pointing to the fact that under certain conditions, and again I'll talk about that, that there's no significant difference in hypertrophic outcomes between moderate and lower intensity high repetition training. All right. When the studies first started coming out, I argued with him, I'll be honest with you. I went, that's crap, that can't be right, that can't be right. But these studies keep coming and coming and coming and coming, and it's gotten to the point now, as much as it irks me to admit it, I actually am prepared to accept I've changed my take on this, I've changed my opinion on this on a conditional basis, and let me get to the end to explain what that condition is. So basically what they're saying is that on a volume load equated basis, that there's fundamentally no studies according to sports, no differential according to sports science studies equated on volume load between higher intensity, moderate intensity, low intensity training when you equate for volume load. All right, you have to equate for volume load. Okay, there are a couple of exceptions. This study here potentially was like a major outlier to that study. And one of the reasons that they think that that was an outlier was maybe the sex, that all the participants were female, and they really need to do further studies about that to see whether sex of the trainer has a significant influence on the way that we train, which I think is fascinating. Okay, so that's basically what I was saying about no significant difference between the training studies. All right, so let me talk about my opinion here. So far what we've said is, okay, so what does Bro Law tell us? Okay, the voice of the hive, as it was the hive mind for bodybuilders, will tell you 16 to 15 repetitions at 60 to 80, that's a horrible 60 to 80% of 1 RM is where you produce maximum outcome. Okay, the sports science community is going to tell you, based on the studies that they have, that there's a range that extends beyond this into lower repetition, heavier weight, okay, and above 15 plus, where the effect size is so small that it's negligible, all right, on average, okay? Now, what's my opinion on this? Okay, so firstly, I would suggest if you're going to look at this, you need to consider the following thing. What are we doing when we're in the gym? We're basically trying to create a mechanical stress from a training input that is going to promote localized muscle protein synthesis. Okay, that's our job in the gym. When you get rid of everything else, when you forget about exercise selection and all this stuff that people want to crap on about, this is what we're doing. We're creating mechanical stresses from training inputs, right? That in turn stimulate a localized muscle protein synthesis response that, in combination with the ingestion of amino acids, mean that we store amino acids, right? So if you think about it, if you separate yourself emotionally from this discussion, is it reasonable that a very, very wide range of potential stresses could actually result in this outcome? Why not? We are adaptive machines, all right? We weren't put on this planet to lift weights, all right? We were put on this planet to survive, and our body has the capacity to adapt in profound ways. So the idea that this range of 6 to 15 that we've been using for a very long time actually has some leeway on either side of that will produce somewhat similar results, very reasonable sort of argument. And when you look at the study data supports that. That's not a finite number. Doesn't start at 6 and doesn't finish at 15. Although this range is viable and valid, doesn't stop at that number. It's not like, it cuts off at 6, it cuts off at 15. There's some room here for extending those ranges. Okay. So what does that mean on a practical level? So Victor Black's practical takeaways. I enjoy reading science studies. I do. I find them fascinating, but I live in the real world. And I actually think that when you get down to it in the real world, we have to consider a couple of things. One is, let me talk about heavier weights to begin with, higher intensity. Okay, I actually think that as an older guy, training with more weight, okay, than you can do 6 repetitions for, is going to potentially introduce more injuries. So if it produced the same result, all right, so if you get outcome X from 6 reps, all right, and you go heavier with weight, right, more intensity, and it still produces outcome X, same outcome, which is what the sports science is saying, and you increase the risk of injury in that process, that doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, why would you do that? All right, we're not getting any benefit, it appears, right? But we're introducing greater wear and tear on our joints. All right. So I would basically say, okay, so even though the science community might say that higher intensity, in sets produce equal amounts of outcome, all right, I don't think that's beneficial going under 6 sets, under 6 reps. In fact, I would go one step further myself. My recommendation is that you start at 8 reps. Why? Because there's no significant differential between these two numbers in all the study data. They're the same. But you can basically see an increase, right, in injury just on an observational basis, an anecdotal basis, right? The heavier weights get. Everybody intuitively knows that. You start messing around with heavier and heavier and heavier weights, the injury rates go up and up and up and up. You only need to look at the studies on powerlifters and strongmen and see how profoundly more often they get injured than bodybuilders to understand that is absolutely true on an anecdotal and a supported basis. So I actually would come up a little bit even from 6. I would say let's start at 8 reps in a set. Okay? Now, you can train basically anything in up to 15 in bro law. Is there a time and a place for high repetition? Absolutely. All right. I will even accept the fact that if you do high enough rep counts, right, and you train to a proximity to failure, you can get very good outcomes from that. I've no doubt in my mind at all about that. So do I believe you need to cut off at 15? No, I don't. I don't believe that, right? I actually think that there's a extension beyond 15 where you can absolutely work. So what would my recommendation to the average guy, that's older guy, that wants to train and is mindful of the fact that he doesn't want to injure himself, he doesn't want to get hurt in the process, excuse me, just fix this, doesn't want to get hurt in the process of training, I would recommend that you actually train somewhere between 8, right, and 15 reps most of the time. Most of the time. Let's just argumentatively say 60, okay, to 70% of your volume in a month should be in this range, which, not perhaps less than ironically lines up with bro law, the voice of experience, right? Guys have been training this way for decades. It makes good sense. That's why they train that way. They get good outcomes, right? Do I think there's scope for guys that wish to extend beyond that, right? Absolutely. So if you enjoy training heavier and lower reps per set, I'm not suggesting you don't do that, right? I don't think it's going to impact on your training, but I do think that you should limit your training, right, in that regard to about 30 to 40% of your total monthly volume, right? You should allocate to outside of this range, right? If you want to take that whole amount and do heavier because you just like to go heavy, by all means, right? If you want to take that whole amount and train in higher rep counts because you enjoy the pump, as it were, by all means. If you want to split some either way, by all means, right? The takeaway from this, guys, is fundamentally this. The range of inputs that you can apply to training outcomes is much, much, much broader than most people think. Okay? It's much wider than most people think. People get caught up, they become almost religious about HIT training is the best training, low repetition, high intensity training. At the other end of the camp, you have these guys that are all about higher volumes. It's the feel, it's the pump, it's the mind-muscle connection. You know what? This is why this argument has raised for decades and decades and decades, because they're both right. They both work. The sports science backs up both of them. You can do this, you get this outcome. You can do that, you get that outcome. The one criticism I have of these studies, right, would be this, and I think it's always going to be there, and that is that I actually believe when you're a beginner, when you're first starting out, just about anything you do, right, just about anything you do is going to elicit a muscle protein synthesis response. The mechanical stress that you need to create as a beginner in the gym can be anything, right? I've even seen studies where guys basically did nothing more than flex their biceps, like contracted flexors on their biceps, and elicited the very same response as someone that would use the weighted load. Exactly the same outcome. But understand, these were untrained subjects. Just the sheer fact that they're creating a mechanical stress that their bodies are not used to is causing adaptation. Now, the limitation to that is very obvious. When you're an absolute beginner, right, you can do anything you want, right? Let's just call it X. Turn up, do it, eat more than a civilian, and you're going to progress, right? The beginner intermediate, right, the middle ground, the guy that's been doing it for a little while, X probably starts to waver in terms of now you need to start to pay attention to a more practical training model, all right? And you probably want to train in that range of 8 to 15, all right? Okay, 2 times a week, all right? Two stimulations per body part per week, okay? When you get to the middle ground, right? The experienced guy that's been doing this for a while, right? He's a middle ground experienced guy, right? Then I think that these studies start to get flawed a little bit because no one's studying bodybuilders in this regard, and I think what they would find is the fact that extremely low, if they ever get studied, extremely low repetition counts, like under 5, right, would start to fall apart for intermediate trainers, the middle ground. I really believe that in my heart. I think that the higher repetition work will hold longer. This is just my opinion, my anecdotal observation. So 15 plus, right, will hold. But I think that at some point in time that less than 5 repetitions, starts to be less than favorable for bodybuilders, right? So where I spend most of my time, for anyone that's interested, is I literally don't train down here for 2 reasons. One is I believe that you're probably going to get a listed a better response as a beginner down here. And 2 is you raise the risk of injury down here. And if you're raising the risk of injury with no additional return on investment, why would you do that? So people say 6. I personally start at 8. And I will go to 15 for most of my work, right? So I will do kind of 60 to 70% of my work here, right? And then occasionally I'll flirt with the higher end, right? That's the kind of 30 to 40% of 1 RM. Right? That's over the course of a training block, over the course of, like, let's say a 1-year mesocycle. So that is my opinion about training intensities. I think what really matters here and what guys need to actually pay attention to, let me find my little thing here, okay, is the fact that at the end of the day, what really matters to us is volume load, okay? So if you want the weight to go up, all right, and the reps then come down, you're going to have to increase the set number, okay? And if you bring the weights down and the reps go up, all right, your sets can come down, okay? So this is the yin and the yang, the balancing act of what matters is volume load, all right? Doesn't really matter if you want to do higher weights and lower reps, or you want to bring the weights down a bit and push up a bit. What matters is ultimately we need to equate for volume load for all intents and purposes, very similar outcome. So that's it for today's video on training intensity. I hope you found that interesting. I hope it breaks some mythology where people say there's this finite range that you have to train in for absolute outcomes. This is the go, bro. This is where you need to train. It's not supported in the evidence at all. It's not supported by my opinion anecdotally. Train where you enjoy training. Train where you believe you have the minimum risk of injury. And if you want to train outside of that zone, spend the majority of time in that, what we would call the 8 to 15 rep range, and spend a smaller fraction in those zones that you enjoy training. By all means, enjoy it. Adherence is always number one. If you enjoy it, by all means, because it is going to have a very, very, very small effect size on your training outcomes if you want to deviate in that regard. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I look forward to seeing you at the next Victor Black Masterclass. Sawadee ka.